Welcome to Successful Parenting, where we, Jackie Rue and Robin Choquette, share practical skills for families to build resilience and healthy connections. As practicing professionals and parents ourselves, we hope this podcast is a resource for parents to grow, reflect, and learn more about themselves and their children. Our approach is simple, tangible, and most importantly, we lead with compassion for the integrity of the families we serve. This podcast should not be taken as medical advice and is intended for informational purposes only. We love our work and we can't wait to watch families gain confidence and open themselves up to new ways of successful parenting. Hi, Jackie.
Hi, Robin. How are things going?
It's great for me. How about you? What have you been up to this week? Working with some schools?
Working some schools. It's interesting. We've had a lot of conversations this week, really both how great it is that this school year has started off with more normalcy. But we've also had a lot of conversations this week, both with teachers as well as parents, just concerns over some of the students' executive functioning skills, homework skills. Through the pandemic, we have seen that there is a lot of lags and things like that. And so I'm really excited about this episode today because out of all the requests we've gotten for different topics, I think this is one of the largest requests I've had. And 2 to 3 calls from parents a week saying, we're just not sure what's going on. But, our child is just really struggling with school, with homework and things like that. So I'm excited that we have Marni Johnson joining us today. I have known Marni probably for 20 years in some capacity. Marni's been in a leadership role at several of the major school districts around the northwest suburbs. She started off as an educational psychologist. She's been, one of her most recent roles was for assistant superintendent at a larger district, as well as being a member of the Attorney General Commission for Special Education.
Wow.
The neat thing is we have partnered with Marni. She is an educational advocate for families. And most recently, we've had several families that have said, they've utilized her services and it has totally turned around their child's opportunities and their child's experiences with school. And it has been so awesome to start to learn and understand our rights and the rights for families when it comes to education. So I want to really take this time to let Marni have the driving seat. And I just want to spend this morning learning from her because every time I talk to her, honestly, I learn more and more.
Welcome, Marni.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jackie and Robin. Jackie, I feel the same way about you. Every time I talk to you, I learn something. Your podcasts have been wonderful to listen to. I feel a connection to those. But yeah, I got into school advocacy recently. I left public schools, which is kind of unique. Most people don't leave public schools, but I started as a school psychologist, and that's when I met you, Jackie, 20 years ago as a school psychologist. And then went into administration. I've always stayed in the special education student services arena. I feel like that has just been my passion and my love in schools. And about 3 years ago, I started kind of going down the road of private practice and kind of seeing where it took me. And I really, really enjoyed the work I was doing with families and with school districts. I've started doing some work in partnerships with school districts as well. And I think it's just been such a wonderful avenue to go down and to be able to help families at a time and educate them on things to ask schools and help them walk them through crisis maybe with schools so that their child can have more success in that arena. It's been wonderful. So my background's in school psych and then administration, and this is where my passion has been the last 20 years.
What is your why, do you think? Obviously, you've been driven for a number of years to really support families and students. What do you think that is about, and how is that connected with what you do as a school advocate?
I feel strong. Advocates sometimes, especially when schools hear the word advocate, they often fear that word, right? And so my job really, I feel like when a family comes to me, I'm trying to listen, I'm trying to figure out what that problem is, and I'm trying to collaborate with the school and rebuild a partnership with the family and the school, and also make sure the students' rights are met at the same time. And I feel like I've done that throughout the 20 years. I've been in various roles. My role has been to be an advocate for students, for parents, for teachers, right? I mean, that hasn't really changed in the 20 years I've been doing this. I now have a little bit different focus where parents are hiring me. So my focus is on the family and on the student, but it's still working in collaboration and building that partnership with the schools. I think sometimes when there's conflict with schools, when there's varying opinions, we get mired kind of in the paperwork and the details, and we lose sight of the picture of the child and what exactly does the child need. And so I want to bring us back to that.
Marnie, process for me and some of this is daunting.
It is.
As a parent, so often when families are at these meetings, they don't know what their rights are. They don't know. Every once in a while, they get that packet of, a bunch of pages that you have to weed through and figure out what to ask for, how to ask. And what I love about your service, it really is the goal is to support children that are struggling. And I think so often become that connection between schools and families. And I think really when you join schools, you truly are joining, even though you're working for the family, you're bringing the family, in the district together. And I like that approach because I don't think everyone always does that.
The process is daunting. When you get into a meeting and you have 7 other people sitting there and we're going through pages of paperwork, kind of plowing through that, it feels very overwhelming. And parents worry, you hear in your practices about parents worrying about their children, their school progress all of the time. And so parents are going in there worried already. And it's a very intimidating process. So I hope to make that process less intimidating. And I can go through the paperwork and help them read the paperwork and help them understand the rules and regulations, but also just that problem solving is so important when we're in a meeting. And there's been some laws passed recently too that I think help with having parents have more voice at the table. Like,
Oh, great.
paperwork has to go home 3 days in advance now. And I think that allows parents to kind of take a look at it, be able to review it, ask questions, come in with questions, and kind of get some of that out of the way so that, again, the focus can really be about problem solving.
Do you find, and this is this might be a loaded question, but I have a child that we really felt needed an IEP, and I think you kind of explain what that means. And the school said, we can do the same accommodations, but we'll just put it on a 504. It'll be easier for you and for us. Do you have any recommendations on that when you run into a situation like that?
And maybe explain, Marnie, the 504 and IEP for our listeners who don't understand.
Yes, let's start there because I think that's probably the easiest thing. So an IEP is through IDEA, which is Individual Disabilities Education Act. It's federal regulation. There's both federal and state regulations that encompass this area. And it really is a plan that has to provide educational benefit for a student. And it's really instruction focused. So there's specialized instruction, there's goals, there's some sort of minutes attached to it, whether that be related services or, like reading, math, something like that. There's identification areas, 12 areas students can be identified in. It's for students that really need that specialized instruction in school. 504 is a little bit more broad. It's a Civil Rights Act. It's from the 504 Rehabilitation Act. And it's really looking at a student's functioning, walking, running, learning. I mean, it could impact any part of their day, a disability could, and they could qualify for a 504, but maybe not necessarily for an IEP because they don't need specialized instruction. So 504 really looks at accommodations, modifications. You can have social work minutes on there. You can have speech minutes on there. I would say for school districts that do have minutes on 504s, usually we're starting to look at IEPs at that point in time because their students are demonstrating a need for minutes. But it should never be about what plan is easier. It should be about, does that student need some basic accommodations to access the curriculum? Then we're looking at a 504. Or does that student really need specialized instruction that will bring them some educational benefit? And that's when we look at an IEP. And really an evaluation should be done by the school district to determine that. Sometimes schools evaluate kids and they determine, you're not eligible for an IEP. But we really feel like these accommodations are going to help you access your classes better, and they're going to level the playing field for you in a classroom. So we're going to place you on a 504. And in some cases, we do a 504 evaluation and we say, you know what, this isn't going to cut it. We really need to look at some specialized instruction for a student and move into that direction. So it's really not about what's easier. It's really about what the need is for that child based on the evaluation that was provided. And some parents provide their own outside evaluations, which are helpful to teams. Teams have to consider that information, go through it, and review it and look at the impact and recommendations within the school setting to determine if they can implement some of those.
That's really interesting. And so it sounds like if a child needs the services of an IEP, they shouldn't be written on a 504. They should be written
No,
on an IEP.
they should be written on an IEP. Yes.
And I think school districts today, the reality is, there's a lot of shortages of social workers and staff and teams. And so I think as much as we're all trying to do our best, I think we do find that, a lot of educators right now are kind of burning the candle at both ends. And I think sometimes, meeting all of these needs can be a process, but I think understand what the needs are. A student could be presenting as unmotivated or lazy, but really there's something behind that. Or,
Right.
a student having a hard time getting to school or something like that.
Right. There's been a trauma in their life. They have processing issues. That's why that evaluation is really so critical. Kind of asking the question, what information do we need to collect? How are we going to collect it? And then really analyzing those results in a way that really looks at the school setting. We also, too, some students hold it together really well during the day. And
Right.
they can get through the school day, but they get home and it's exhausting. They're cognitively done. They're emotionally spent, taking all of their time and energy to really try to get through the day. And we see this with high school students more often. And now they're spending hours on homework, 5-6 hours of homework. I get that a lot from parents. And now they're up till 12 or 1 o'clock doing homework, and it's frustrating and it's a battle at home. That is school impacting them. And sometimes I think schools tend to forget that, but that is a side effect from what's happening in schools. So how can we put accommodations in place during the day so that a student can have positive family time in the evening, their brains kind of rest and relax so they can get started for the next day and wake up ready to learn.
What would be some things that they should be looking for to say, hey, maybe we need to find out more information? Could you tell our listeners?
Consistent signs that their child is struggling. So we all know that kids can get a bad grade on a test. Maybe they have anxiety about giving a presentation in class. Those things would be situational. If a student is consistently, failing tests, maybe not coming to school, attendance is starting to drop. Maybe they're reporting to family, to their parents, oh my gosh, I'm nervous to go to school. I don't want to go to school today. I have stomach ache. We see a lot of students with attendance issues in the nurse's office. Maybe they're struggling with friends. When we start seeing consistent patterns, or parents start seeing consistent patterns, that's when it's time to go to the school and say, what, I'm seeing this at home. Are you seeing this at school? What steps can we take together to address this so my child can have a more positive school day?
I hear from, probably 30% of the school districts I work with, we really can't evaluate the child isn't coming to school. And that's really on the family. If the family could get the child to school, then we can have a better understanding of what's going on. And sometimes it becomes almost like this back and forth, because I hear that a lot. Students that aren't coming to school, it's not that they need an IEP, they need to come to school.
I'll be very honest with you. I feel very strongly that a child who's not coming to school, there's an issue behind that. So it isn't appropriate for a school to say you have to get your child to school so we can evaluate them. I mean, certainly we have to physically get them there at some point to evaluate them. But if a child isn't coming to school, that is a symptom of something larger. And so we have to figure out how to evaluate that. Maybe we're partnering with a private therapist. Maybe we're, just getting them in the morning to talk with the social worker about what's going on and trying to figure out what's behind that issue. But it isn't an issue we can ignore. Jackie, you and I have seen that for years. Students start coming to school and they eventually drop out. And
right.
And we go, well, the parent didn't get the child to school. And that just isn't the case. We know something is going on. It's a symptom of a larger issue.
I've never thought about what you just said about if a child's not going to school, schools could partner with private agency and get some of that psychological testing done. I've never heard that used and I've never thought about that, but that sure would make a difference for a lot of families who would like somebody on the outside and don't maybe have the means. Because as you know, some of these services can be costly.
Yes, I think we've always thought of other services outside of school as other, right? And I think it's really important as an advocate, as educators, to partner with everybody who is working with that child. It's important to have releases signed so that that student is getting, we're all connecting to make sure and to ensure that the student is getting the right services. But yes, school districts can call a student's therapist and say, hey, this is happening. Can we work with you to try to figure out what the problem is so that we can develop a plan to help support the student? Are you willing to join us for a meeting? Schools can do that. I think that schools often hesitate to do that. I don't know why. I think it's just kind of, they've got so much going on usually during the day that's hard to do, but we certainly can do that.
And the neuropsych testing, do they have to have that for the IEP?
You don't. Parents go through and teams go through what's called a domain review or a case study review. Different school districts call it different things sometimes, but it's typically called a domain review, where they go over each area of a child's functioning, like intellectual, social, emotional, visual, hearing. They determine what is happening with the child right now in that moment, what information they have, and then what information they need to collect. It doesn't always entail intellectual testing or neurological testing. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. I would tell you it often does in the earlier grades where learning issues are being identified. We find that most kids are identified for a learning disability or a hearing or visual impairment much earlier on in their education, and you see emotional diagnoses more so in high school. I do think though that's happening earlier, and you probably see that in your practice too, younger kids having difficulty with regulation and emotion. But you don't have to have a neurological battery to be eligible.
Are schools typically pretty supportive of IEPs, and when you face it, they're like, great, this is something we're more than willing to do? Or do you feel like it's something that they can be a little bit resistant?
I think that most schools in general are very collaborative. When you have a team who has dedicated themselves to working with students with special needs, most of the time, everybody is very collaborative. Certainly, I think schools are right now in a tough spot. We've had this pandemic, right? And we know kids are falling behind from the pandemic. So I think it's been very difficult to figure out, are kids behind because of the pandemic, or is this a disability related issue? I think that's been tough for schools, but I think most schools in general are very supportive of IEPs. I think right now we're in a situation though where schools are struggling to find social workers, to find aides, one-to-one aides for kids, and that can be pretty difficult for families. I think for the most part, I've had positive experiences with school districts so far.
Yeah.
Do you find there's any differences between public and private in terms of what they can offer and in terms of students that have these needs?
Yeah, there is, and it's in actually IDEA regulations. So kids who attend private school, homeschool, school districts are required to find students, kind of cast out that net and find students who may have disabilities. And that's for any student living in their residency boundaries. That includes students who are private and homeschooled. So if we get wind of somebody who's homeschooled or a school district does, then they're really responsible to make sure that that child doesn't have a disability and find students who might need support. However, there is a limited amount of funding for students who qualify, who are private school students, and it's called proportionate share services. And so IDEA requires all school districts to have a proportion of their IDEA funds allocated to support kids in private school settings. Once that funding's gone, though, for the year, it's a very small amount. And once it's gone for the year, it's gone. School districts are then no longer required to service those students. So you do find that if a student has had an IEP in public school and they move to private school, and it's the school district in which the private school is located that services the student, not the student's school district, which can get a little tricky. They might only have partial services from their IEP. They will write an individual service plan, the district will, that services that private school. The team will decide together what service is the most important to provide that student. And a lot of private schools now, I would tell you, do have different levels of service for kids. You'd be surprised. They have resource rooms and supportive classes and tutors and different things that they have set up to support students who may have some different learning needs.
And so these IEPs be able to transfer from one school to the other, like you're talking about, right?
Yeah, one public school to another, yes. So if you are in a public school and you're transferring to another public school, that receiving school will get the IEP and is required to implement it as is and hold a meeting to determine if any changes need to be made.
What's interesting to me, and I know this is like a wish, In the last couple of years, a lot of my clients that are graduating high school, even though they're 18, and there's a lot of gaps in their emotional maturity and just kind of where they are in terms of learning, and pandemic has compounded it.
Mhm,
As
mhm.
they go to college, many of these IEPs turn into 504s.
Right.
I truly wish colleges still had IEPs because I think so many of my students, they lose so much support from high school to college.
IEPs run from age 3 to 22. And I say 22 is if you're eligible to stay for transitional services. Once students leave high school, then we're looking at 504 plans for college or a college plan to support the student. I would tell you there's a growing number of colleges. I have seen lots of changes over the past 20, 21 years. There's a growing number of colleges that have supported services. The problem is they're an extra cost to families often. And so that places kind of the burden squarely on families. I would love to see more growth in services at the community college level. I think our community colleges have set up different programs, but it would be great to expand on some of those for the taxpayers in the area and for students to have kind of that next step of education at the college level. That would be my wish, my hope moving forward, because transition services, particularly in Illinois, are not in a great spot right now. And I know, school districts struggle to get agencies at the table. Agencies struggle with funding and with getting people employed to be able to help. And so it definitely has been a struggle in that transition in the world of post-secondary services.
Mhm.
Many parents will say, I can't get my child to do homework. They're not getting it done. I'm so frustrated. And a lot of times I find they don't know how to organize themselves. They don't know how to kind of self
Mhm.
motivate. These are really a lot of times services that our students need.
Yeah, a lot of high schools offer executive functioning services. I would say that probably due to limited time during the school day, they have a very small amount of time to provide that service often, but they do have them. And I think that's been a growing need, particularly in high school before college for students. And we've seen those programs expand. I know Rush had an executive functioning program that lots of districts utilized and had them come in and teach teachers, special ed teachers in particular, how to utilize those strategies within resource classes to help students. That is definitely an area that's been growing. And I think, again, the pandemic probably didn't help that area either. Students are kind of struggling to get back on track in school and lack some of those skills, and they need to be retaught.
Yeah. Marnie, when schools are looking at students and students are changing and evolving, and how often do they evaluate those IEPs and look at it, update them is the way I would think about it. How often does that happen? Is there a standard?
Yeah, there is. There's a requirement by law that IEPs be reviewed annually, so within a year of being developed. And a reevaluation must occur, meaning you have to kind of look at if any testing or evaluation needs to happen every 3 years. So there is a process to that. I would tell you that as a parent, you can request an IEP meeting at any time. Schools are usually amenable to holding one. Sometimes it's a full team. Sometimes it might just be the people that are necessary to be at the table for that, whatever that presenting problem is. But IEP teams meet regularly and should be meeting if there's any new information that comes up. What I found and I still see in the high school setting is that a student comes in eligible for a learning disability but starts manifesting some emotional issues, as a freshman. That team sits down then to kind of consider that new information. What's happening? Do we have to look at this differently? Do we need to add goals that support the emotional piece that the student's deficits in that area? And then they tweak that plan. So it really is a fluid process.
How do you enhance like that collaboration between the parents and the school? Is there any recommendations you would give for parents? Because I agree with you. I think most schools really do want to support students in a way that's going to help them. How can you collaborate with the school, or do you have any suggestions for the families that are listening today?
I think be open to what the school is telling you. They see your child in a different setting than you do, and that information can be very valuable. I would also say, listen, be a good listener, and also don't be afraid to ask questions. Sometimes I think parents are very intimidated by going into a school, but
I
don't,
would agree.
you're really their child's best advocate. And the more information and the more questions people can ask and the more information that's shared, we usually get to the heart of the issue, and it can be resolved. When parents hold back and are afraid to ask, then things don't always move forward. I would also say, like anything, like, I don't know the finance world, so I hire a financial advisor to help me with that, right? I do services, my advocacy services look very different for each family. Sometimes it's just coaching through a present problem. And they just need to know what to ask or who to go to or how to frame a question and just a little advice. And sometimes they need somebody at the table. And it's okay to ask somebody else for an opinion or bring in somebody with a fresh set of eyes. And from a school perspective, I think it's really important for schools to listen to families and really listen to their concerns and the needs of their child, because again, they're seeing their child in a different environment than the school people are. And when we can kind of bring all that information together, it can move things forward in a much better way.
As a parent myself, sitting with 8 people, you just expect that they know what they're doing and they're right. And oftentimes, 8 people in a room with laptops typing away, it's very intimidating for a parent that doesn't know the school system and really doesn't know how to navigate. So I think having a you at the table can bring comfort that, okay, I'm not alone in this process. And I don't think schools mean for families to feel alone, and I have some families too that, English is not their first language. And so I think a lot of times there's a lot of just gaps in understanding. And
Mhm.
so I think it's so helpful. How do you know, and when do you call someone like you? How do you even know when you should?
That's a great question. I think parents call me at very different times in the process. And usually, whenever they call, they're frustrated about something. So they've reached a frustration point. That can be early in the process. They may not even have asked for an evaluation yet. That hasn't happened yet. Sometimes the student is farther along and the parent really knows there needs to be something different that has to occur, like a change of placement, but doesn't really know how to ask that. And the school hasn't communicated that. And so they're frustrated. I think you call at any time. And I feel like there's a lot of really great directors out there who take the time to educate families on their rights and really kind of walk through that. But sometimes that doesn't always happen. And so if you have questions, that's when you need to call somebody. I do a 50-minute free consult, and sometimes that's all I do with families. And they get enough information from that. And that's cool, right? If they feel like they got a lot from the 50 minutes with me and they're not going to hire me moving forward, that's great. I'm happy to be of help that way. And some really want, that those full blown services from me, and that's good too. Like anything, I use that financial analogy because, like anything you don't know, I think it's always wise to ask an expert in that area. Or, lots of therapists like yourself know a lot about the school system and kind of how to start navigating. So if a family has a therapist, they might ask their therapist, what should I do? How should I communicate with the school? Those are always good questions to ask.
Yeah, because we do. I mean, that's one of the things. The first thing, right, is we get that release for the school if the parents let
Yeah.
us to have that and to build that collaborative. So it can be, an entire team working together and
Yes.
understanding. You see more success when we approach our work like that.
Yes.
This is kind of one of the last questions. Do you ever consider outside placements for students? Do you ever feel like, the student can't get their needs met? We've had some students that have probably 10 or 12 inpatient stays, which is, staying overnight at like a psychiatric hospital for, emotional concerns. Do you ever recommend outside placements? Is that something that you...
Yeah, I work with a lot of families on that piece in particular. Because usually their children are at a crisis level, at that point. Schools are required to offer a continuum of services. So when a student has an IEP, there's services within the gen ed setting all the way through the continuum to residential that schools would have to pay for. And so they move students through that continuum until they're in the right placement, right? You want the placement that has the most gen ed connections to students, but also is meeting that students need. It's called the least restrictive environment. For some students, that is a therapeutic day school. And there's many in the area that I've worked with and that school districts work with. And sometimes removing a student from this general school environment into a therapeutic day school is really helpful. But the goal is always to get the student back into a general education setting at some point. So it's always about kind of meeting the needs and getting back in there to get the student functioning at a better her level.
I'm so glad that families have an option to call you, to utilize you. It's just a different experience when you have someone that really
It is.
knows
It
the
is.
language and the word. I mean, I wouldn't have known half this stuff. And I think most parents don't know this stuff because it's a lot of legal stuff. If you ever, and I love how you said, Marni, if you ever think that there's a reason to call. If you ever
Oh, yeah.
suspect, it's always better to ask. And I think the more interventions we can do, the earlier we can do it, makes such a difference long-term for students.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, Marni, we have 3 questions for you. And these are 3 questions we ask all of our guests. You can
Okay.
pick from 1, 2, or 3, whatever you want to answer. I'll read all 3 and then you can decide and let us know. So the first one is, we want you to tell us a funny story about your parenting. This could be from your childhood, something funny that your parents did. The second question is, what TV, family, or movie would you want to be a part of and why? And our third question is, what does successful parenting mean to you?
It's a funny story first.
Okay, we love those.
I have an 11-year-old. I listened to your podcast from last week with technology. That's where we're at right now. I am a very assertive person, organized. I like to control what's happening around me. And I think I realized early on that wasn't going to happen when I had my first child. You have this idea of what success you're going to be, and I'm going to feed my child all organic foods, and I'm going to, they're going to be on a sleep schedule and all of that stuff. Right? And then you have this baby and you're like, oh my gosh, what am I doing with the child? And I remember the first time my husband went out for the evening and I have this infant, and all of a sudden, within 2 hours of my husband leaving, she's got a spiked fever and she's vomiting all over the house, all over. Yeah. And so, I'm leaving trails of vomit all over the house and stripping her clothes off and stripping my shirt off and texting my husband, like, you have to come home. There's vomit all over the house. And I think in that moment, I knew, like, I am not going to be in control of a lot of things with this child for the next, 20 years. And I have to kind of wrap my head around that, right? And that's going to be okay. And I think that is part of that successful parenting piece too, to know you have to let your child be themselves while also knowing when to kind of put boundaries in place and guidance in place. I remember hearing Dr. Ken Ginsburg speak. He wrote a book, I can't remember the title of it. He spoke in Barrington about parenting and kind of about the stages of parenting and moving into that coaching stage, which I feel like I'm moving into now, knowing kind of when to step into a situation, when not to, kind of letting your child be themselves while also providing them with love. Sometimes I feel like, I have an 11-year-old and I want to explode. And I have to internally say, okay, I have to step back from this, think about how I want to approach it, and then approach it.
It's that patience and that pause.
Patience, pause, love, and kind of letting your child be who they are and not what you had in mind for them to be, which is harder than you think. And so
thank you. Okay, Marni, we will have it in our description, but if people are interested in talking to you, how can they get in touch with you? Do you want to share your website?
My website is northshoresped.com. It's one word, northshoresped.com. You can contact me right through the website. You can actually set up a consult call through the website as well. It's pretty easy to do. And then once I get that information, I reach out to people right away.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being a part of a great conversation. Another good one, Jackie.
Yeah. And Marni, I know we will be using your services. I said in the beginning, all my families that work with Marni, I get like thank you cards for referring her. I mean, they're just, it's one of those things that I think sometimes it is expense, but it changes the whole direction of the future for the child. And we're not trying to over accommodate, but we're trying to give the right level of support so children can really begin to thrive and learn these skills. So when it is time for them to launch, they have these skills that are so needed. But I so appreciate you, Marni.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me today. It's been a blast.
Okay, well, let's, Robin, I think I will see you next week on our next episode, but I'm really excited to keep having these conversations.
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for joining us, and make sure to subscribe and like us to catch our next episode, where we will take you on a journey to find new ways of successful parenting.